Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's broadcast.
Broadcast.
We talked to Jefferson this week, though.
He's back.
Yep.
We got a letter saying, "Will we ever hear from Jefferson again?"
Well, that was pretty interesting. The guy listened to cataloged every show, and figured out that Jefferson only appeared 22 out of 52 times, which, by the way, we got a streak going. We've done 52 shows every year for 3, 4, 5 years now.
No wonder I'm tired.
Take that, network TV.
Yeah, most programs do 13 per annum, if that. But we do 52, and I'm so glad. And
me too. I'm really proud of that.
And we said this on the program. I want to say it in a different way. I'm more comfortable in character than out because I know what Jefferson thought, and I know about his life. And in my own life, I'm less certain. I'm often confused about the world, and it's unclear what the response of a good citizen should be. So it's easier to be Jefferson than to be me. That's probably why I do historical characters. But I think that this is a gigantic national crisis, not only of the Constitution, but of the survival of the American Republic. And unfortunately, this has been sort of forced on all of us. I'll bet everyone listening would agree with the sentence that I'm about to say, which is that in the last months or years, they have had conversations about this again and again and again until they're so sick of talking about it that they just wish we could just turn it off with a switch. But we can't, because everything is at stake here. And I'm not just saying that, whether Donald Trump is a good or bad president. It's about the Constitution, the rule of law, due process, all the things that we think we're committed to. It's all kind of teetering on the edge of a chasm here.
Empires fall. We have seen it in our lifetime.
And I read over and over and over again these books about the end of the Roman Republic. It's one of my areas of specialty. I was a classical scholar at the University of Minnesota and at Oxford, and then at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And you read about this. It's a great book, by the way, by Tom Holland called Rubicon, The Last Days of the Roman Republic. And as you read his great book, he's a tremendous writer, reads like a novel. As you read
it does.
About the collapse of the Roman Republic, you keep on about every fifth page, you think, is he talking about Rome or is he talking about America?
Yes, but let me be the optimist again, may I?
Yes, sir.
We'll keep this short and get to the show, but we have something they did not.
What's that?
Our Constitution.
We do have the Constitution, which we are stomping and trampling upon right and left.
Well, we'll see.
And by the way, my friend, I was out at Loxaw Lodge.
No.
I was out at Loxaw Lodge.
Oh, no.
For 2 retreats, one on the space program and one on Charles Dickens. And there was a man named Nicholas there, a wonderful man. He was with his father who was named Nick. So Nick and Nicholas. Great. One of the nicest father-son combinations I've ever met in my life. It just kind of made me think, gosh, I wish I'd had that sort of a relationship with my own father. Mine was good, but it wasn't like this. And Nicholas took me aside. He's this brilliant young graduate student in Washington, D.C., and he took me aside and he said, I just want you to know, don't drop the podcasts and don't cut them short. Don't cut the podcast short just because they're...
Oh, you mean the intro, this bit?
Yeah. He said, don't listen to the critics. And I said, well, I'm with you. So listen to that. And the other thing that they said, my friend, what's about to come out of my mouth, is where's Swenson? Where's Swenson? We hear about him. Maybe he's a bot. Does he even exist? Are you throwing your voice? Why is he?
If you were, I'd be a lot better at this.
Is he confined to a bed? Is he in jail? Why don't we?
Let's not get personal.
Why has no one ever seen this Swenson? And I have to say, look, he's a very private man. He works very hard at his real job, which is Makoche Recording
Not to change
Studios.
the subject, but
they're all like, "Can you bring him sometime? Will you comp him? Are you too cheap to comp him?" And I said,
actually, you've offered that.
I've offered, on the canoe trips in the summer. And
I work really hard. I have a lot of responsibilities.
Here it comes.
I don't get out much.
You don't get out much, but that's on you.
But I have in the past couple of weeks. You know what? I did something I was going to tell you. I went to hear the Bismarck Mandan Symphony Orchestra.
Which is excellent. Beverly Everett, my dear, dear friend.
And I haven't been there for years, and it was the most enjoyable.
What was the topic?
Well, it was
movies, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a contemporary
It was
show.
they do this before the Academy Awards.
They started with a medley of cartoon music. It was great, and it so inspired me that I was like, I want to find a great symphony orchestra that is performing Beethoven's Ninth sometime this year and go there. I don't care.
Did you talk to Beverly? She might do it for you.
No, I don't have. Yeah, I don't know that I could.
I could talk to her. And you mentioned cartoons.
But anyway,
I just want to do a quick drama.
Can I finish that thought?
No, sure.
Because it was like, Bismarck, we're a small town. We really are.
105,000 people.
We're out in the middle of nowhere.
Absolute nowhere.
It's not like there's artists flocking to be here because of the conducive
No
creative
bohemian
atmosphere.
art colonies here.
But there was our local symphony, and they're supported by all sorts of people who have the means, the sense of community,
the joy they take in having a local
there's
symphony.
Things like that going on all over America. So when we get lost in impeachment and government problems and stuff, these communities go on and they thrive. It was kind of I don't want to say an epiphany, but it was a good evening, and I did enjoy myself.
I'm so glad.
I got out.
Did.
I got out.
You got out of the house and you went 2 blocks to the Bell Mayhew's Theater. 2 blocks.
No, it was more like 5.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to this guy who clocked the shows.
Okay.
The clock the shows.
Yeah, 42%.
We do get email about. There are people who write in and. What am I paying my tax dollars for? I want Jefferson. I don't want this other guy, in his opinion. And
great.
Well, we
get some of the other too, do we not?
We do. And I stand by you.
And you're the one who sets the tone on this. I don't come in saying I want to be out of character this week.
No, well,
I listen to you on these things.
Oh boy, so that makes me responsible?
No, I'm just saying that you often say, I think this one should be out of character. Don't you?
Well, sometimes
do you
I
not?
do. Yeah, because I feel like we don't see Jefferson enough. So he's coming back. And in fact, we're going to have some audio questions that listeners have phoned in. You can do that
and
at jeffersonhour.com. Go there and you can call. We have a Jefferson Hour hotline or whatever it's called. You can call and leave a question for President Jefferson. Now, I will also say that the in-character, out-of-character programs are dictated in large part by the questions we receive from listeners.
That is partly true.
So,
I'm going to bring in.
I'm done now. I'm all done.
In a few weeks, I'm going to bring in a crow.
Except support the show, please.
I'm going to bring in a crow so you can eat it.
Oh, after your
after my comedy show in Norfolk, and it's sold out. There's a waiting list. They're storming the theater.
Are they going to book a second show?
I think they might. And so I want you to eat crow because I remember. I can even remember the way you sneered. I've been in therapy.
It was
for
all
weeks.
your daughters.
You and my daughter were like,
I had to follow up.
And I want to say one more thing as long as we're at this.
Yeah, we better be done
out there doing the space thing.
Uh-huh.
And I had been talking about it with my daughter, who's I talked with. She's in England. I talked to her on FaceTime, and I was saying, how we can talk about the space program and how we landed on the moon in 1969. How this was maybe one of the greatest moments in the history of civilization. It was the moment when we left the cradle and began to move to beyond the biosphere of the Earth and so on. And she finally said, "Man, you boomers." She said, "Man, you boomers, you're so full of it." We have to love Woodstock, and we have to love the space program, and Vietnam.
Stop! You're making me laugh.
And no, it's true. And she's like, "You boomers just go on and on and on about as if your lives were the only lives, and everyone who comes after must bow to the things that you all regard." She said, "I get it. The space program is good, but the kind of reverence, the kind of misty-eyed way you talk about these things, get over it. You boomers are done. Your time is gone."
Well, that's the point exactly. Is that she's saying on the one hand that we feel there's no room for anybody else, and on the other hand, she's saying there's no room for you.
Well,
anyway.
You get off the stage what they're saying is, for goodness sakes, Woodstock. Okay, so 300,000 people go to upstate New York and wallow in the mud for a few days. Get over it.
Oh my.
And then she, I don't even want to bring up the B word, the Beatles. She's like, "I love the Beatles as well as the next person, but really, they're the only people who ever sang a song."
Oh my, yeah. Well, all I would say to Catherine is, Your day is coming, dear.
No, they got nothing. What are they going to point at? What are they going to point to?
When
What's
they're
the Kardashians?
when they're our age. Anyway, we should go to the show.
All I'm saying is,
losing people. Like
no,
in here,
we're gaining
dials
people.
being clicked
No, I
off.
mean even Nicholas is going to say enough already now. And his dad, Nick and Nicholas, they were great.
This was a fun show this week. I hope everyone enjoys it. Please, if you can, support the Jefferson Hour. Go to jeffersonhour.com. And if you have the means and you're willing, click on donate. You can become a member of the 1776 Club, get some extra content. But we do appreciate the show. Clay and I take nothing for doing
That
this.
is true. But 3 cultural tours coming up next January 10th through 15th.
Well, you do
10th through.
Now that's a big deal.
I get to say that.
Yeah.
January 10th through 15th will be J. Robert Oppenheimer, the building of the atomic bomb and the decision to drop the atomic bomb. That's January 10th through 15th.
If you want to go on the Lewis and Clark tour this summer, you're out of luck because it's already filled.
But you can already sign on for next year. And then the second one, 17 through 22 January, will be Thoreau's Walden, America's greatest single book, and America's greatest single poem, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass.
That's
and
great.
Then in Monterey in March, the dates have not yet been set yet, but not this March, but next March, John Steinbeck's California. So go to the website, sign up. We're also planning our second France trip. We're planning a Jefferson in Virginia trip, and we're planning a Jefferson in Homer's Greece trip. So come
That's
one,
great.
come all.
And again, thank you all for sending in your questions. I read every single one of them, even if we don't have a chance to answer them all. We do read them, and they guide our direction. So thanks again, and let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mister Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author and creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. But seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson, and good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
It's been a while since we've talked, sir. I trust all things are well at Monticello. I must tell you, I began to order my seeds for the garden this year.
It's that time of year, sir. Things are already underway at Monticello. We don't quite grow 12 months per year, but very close to it.
Yes, and a magnificent garden it is, sir. I congratulate you.
If I could choose my destiny, have any role in the world that I could possibly imagine, it would be to be a gardener on an extensive scale near a market of some sort, to feed myself and my family, of course, and to experiment with interesting plants and seeds from around the world, but to be a gardener on a sort of grand scale, make it a scientific, experimental garden, a laboratory of botany. I think that would be my truest happiness, to read books, to be with my children and grandchildren, and to putter about in the garden growing things. Because when you put a seed in the soil and it breaks through the top and forms a flourishing green plant, that's essentially the very basis of life on earth.
You've often said a famous quote about he who labors in the earth.
Oh, that's Notes on Virginia. That's more about farming. But I did say, those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people.
I found a quote from the prophet Elijah, who I'm certain you're familiar with.
I've read that book.
He says, he who works in the soil is always in the arms of God.
I wouldn't, of course, put it quite that way. I would say nature's God, or nature. But yes, and I will say that I knew my biblical text well. There are a number of echoes of the Bible in my letters and other writings. The Bible is an extraordinary anthology of ancient wisdom and history, and I was very well aware of it, as I think all well-educated people should be. I'm not particularly a Christian, as you know. I'm more of a kind of deistic Unitarian, but I still think that the biblical texts are extraordinary. Almost more than any other text, I like the parable of the mustard seed, which applies to this very conversation. Christ says, think of the mustard seed. Faith is like the mustard seed. It's almost invisible. You can barely see it. It's like the tip of a pencil. You put it in the ground, and this flourishing push, this large profusion of growth comes out of it. That's the nature of the fecundity of the earth, the fertility of the planet, and the basis of wealth and happiness.
I'd like to, at this time, Mr. President, present some questions to you from your many listeners, if that would be all right.
Of course.
Wesley Cheney has written to you and says, "Dear Citizen Jefferson, while we are all well aware of how the Danbury Baptist inspired you to proclaim an eternal wall of separation between church and state, I would like to know more of your experience with and opinion of Methodists." He says his namesake is John Wesley.
I was myself a Unitarian and a rational Christian, if you can speak of such a term. I'm against enthusiasm in all of its forms. The word enthusiasm literally means filled with God, that the divine energies of the world have percolated into the human soul. And so I really am a rationalist. I'm a materialist. I think that everything that exists is measurable, that if it's not measurable, it probably doesn't exist. I even said that the soul is corporeal and dies probably with the body. I'm against metaphysics in almost all of its forms, but very fond of physics, which is about real things in the real world. So Methodism, with its waves of public enthusiasm, its reformist tendencies, and its belief that people can be sort of swept up by a new understanding of Christ's redemptiveness. I find all of that interesting, but it is not my own way of seeing God. God for me is a kind of celestial physicist or mechanic, an inventor, a designer, a creator, who spun the planets and created the chain of being of which humans seem to be at the top. And then that God, in my view, has largely withdrawn, continues to look benevolently down upon that magic of creation. But the God that I rationally revere, not worship, does not interfere in our lives, does not change the destinies of nations in war and peace, does not help my crops to grow, does not help my daughter to survive a terrible disease. That it seems to me that asking God to intervene in that way is to belittle him, to bring somebody of celestial potency down to mere human concerns.
He goes on to say in his letter, Mr. Cheney says, that there's some real similarities between you and John Wesley, what he refers to as the pragmatic approach to personal improvement, but then he gets a bit more inquisitive and says he wants to know if you ever flirted with Methodism during your studies at William and Mary. Were there any Methodists in your Republic of Letters? Did you read or own any books by Mr. Wesley? And what role did Methodism have in propagating the ideals of the Enlightenment in America?
Well, I can answer the last. The answer to the first series of questions is essentially no. I didn't have contact with Methodists. I wouldn't have disdained them in any way, of course, but I would have felt that their lives were in some sense on a parallel track, that these were different sorts of ways of seeing, and mine was a scientific, materialist, rational approach. So this was not something that had much place in my life at any point. But I can answer the question about the principles of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was not atheistic, but it was on the road to atheism. There were plenty of devout Christians amongst Enlightenment figures, but the Enlightenment basically said, let's look at the Bible as we look at other texts, as we look at Tacitus, as we look at Livy, as we look at Plutarch, as we look at Polybius. Let's examine it the way texts are examined. And when we read in Livy, for example, about the Roman gods making statues bleed from their eyes or statues come to life and so on, we dismiss this as superstition. And it seems to me that the same sort of rational scrutiny should come to the miracles and the healings of the New Testament. That when we hear that Christ could calm a storm or raise Lazarus from the dead, it seems to me that a rational person should say that's really beyond the realm of possibility. If that's true, that's amazing, but it probably can't be true because the laws of gravitation and thermodynamics and so on don't just stop. for some sort of divine intervention, that this is very unlikely. And so we need to look at the Bible the way we look on so many other texts, with a kind of curiosity and a desire to learn from it, to pick what wisdom we can from its many verses and books, but to be rigorous and not simply to abandon our critical thinking skills merely because someone said this is a sacred text.
I can't imagine that was a belief that was generally held amongst the population of churchgoers in your time, sir.
You are correct, and it's not something that I generally said either. I kept this very private in my letters to my most trusted friends.
I'm glad you feel free to discuss it now, sir.
Well, it's long after the fact.
Let's move on to another question, something a bit lighter, sir, if we might. A question from a Don Kuntz. He says he knows that you played chess. He wanted to know how proficient you were, if you would be willing to speak about that, and perhaps how frequently you played.
I played with some frequency, particularly during my time in France, where chess was a bigger thing than it tended to be in the colonial world of Virginia. I actually played a number of games of chess against Benjamin Franklin.
Really?
And I won once.
Once?
Yes, and I was so pleased that I noted it. This was an unusual thing. Franklin had a better mind for chess than I do. Chess is a strategic game that requires an extraordinary subtlety of thought and great concentration. And I was adequate, I will say, but I would never consider myself to be an adept.
Chess requires a certain spirit of competition, does it not? I mean, you have to be aggressive against your opponent.
I'm not much of a warrior, and I don't really think in those terms. I know that this will perhaps sound disingenuous, but my temperament is really a gentle, retiring sort of temperament. I don't feel competitiveness. I don't have a great deal of ego attachment. I don't need to win. I feel strongly about some things, particularly involving liberty and the rights of man.
But to be a good chess player, you must want to win, sir.
I don't really have that spirit. Of course, I'm willing to win, and I think chess is a very civilized game. And there were chess books that I had in my library. There were already manuals of chess playing and chess moves that existed in my time. I just don't have that kind of deep competitiveness that says I must win. That sounds like Colonel Hamilton, frankly, to me. Although he'd probably, if he were losing, just sweep the pieces off the board and go away.
Were there any other games that you played for amusement, Mr. Jefferson?
No, I didn't allow cards or dice at Monticello because I had seen how they desolate families.
They were sort of associated with gambling, right?
Gambling, yes. and aristocracy, card games in Jane Austen novels and so on. What I did do was supervise my grandchildren in their games on the lawn. They would race. I would put the older ones behind and the younger ones ahead, the faster ones behind and the younger ones ahead to sort of handicap the races. And then I'd have a white handkerchief and I would stand on the west portico of Monticello. They'd all line up according to my strictures, and then I would drop the handkerchief and off they would go, and I would be the gentle umpire, and everyone would be made to feel rewarded for having participated and not necessarily for winning.
More of a physical exercise nature of a game.
And I didn't horse race myself, but I went to the races from time to time.
You did?
I felt a little sheepish about that because a lot of gambling goes on there too, but I justified it, as humans will do, by saying that this was a way of breeding up horses in Virginia.
Sir, we're going to take a short break now, but we do have some more interesting questions about Concord and Lexington and the founders not anticipating political parties. I'll present those to you in our next segment.
I welcome them, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with President Thomas Jefferson, and he's been kind enough to answer listener questions. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
I have a series of questions here. I want to begin with one from Stephen Shepard. He writes, what was the immediate colonial response to the shootings at Concord and Lexington? We know these events contributed to the decision to rebel, but what was the local government response?
Well, it was like a fire bell in the night. We had been struggling with the British ministry and with Parliament and even to a certain degree with King George III, over taxation policy and regulation and a whole range of other annoyances, some of them very serious. We all thought that this would be worked out in council, in debate, by remonstration and petition, that at some point, without any loss of life, we would be able to settle our differences and move forward as colonies of Great Britain, and individual Americans would be citizens of the British Empire. When Lexington and Concord occurred, we realized to our extraordinary chagrin that this was now a war, that it was no longer possible to think that this could be amicably settled, that the British had fired on American citizens, that they decided to win the struggle through violence, through militarism. And at that point, and I had been sensing for quite a long time that we were going to have to declare independence from Britain, and that events would lead inevitably in that direction. But I don't think anybody expected to see that level of hostility. It was a shock to the sensibilities of the nation, and the news traveled very fast. And at that point, we realized there's probably no turning back now when it comes to firing muskets at fellow citizens of Great Britain, that there's probably no way to settle that amicably thereafter.
The local response, there were militia in these communities. Were there armaments in these communities?
Yes, the British were trying to secure magazines, armaments, caches of weapons, and that was the reason for those marches. And this electrified everyone locally, regionally, and nationally. The news didn't get to Virginia and the Carolinas for a number of days, but that news traveled with extraordinary speed through Massachusetts and to Boston and Philadelphia and New York. And everybody then first lamented the loss of the lives of fellow colonial citizens, and immediately began to train to get more serious, because now it was no longer some marching around and drilling. We now realized that we were going to have to prepare for war. And it wasn't very long before George Washington of Mount Vernon was unanimously chosen to be the commander-in-chief, a role that he took up with some reluctance. And every American realized this is no longer a kind of a game. This is war. This is a war for national survival against tyranny. All this had been somewhat rhetorical up till this moment. But when blood begins to be shed, it can no longer be seen as a sort of a philosophical discussion about political theory.
If something like this happened during my lifetime, Mr. Jefferson, there would be much beyond local control. We would look to the national government to give us an answer, to give us a call to action, a direction.
There was no national government.
And so it must have fallen, as this question asks, to local government officials, and I would assume each community dealt with it in their own way.
It was, of course, most acute in Massachusetts, in the Bay Colony. That's where the revolution had really been located so far. Maybe I should use the term rebellion. That's where the Boston Tea Party had occurred. That's where the Boston Massacre had occurred.
The news didn't travel fast enough for any immediate reaction, I would suppose.
The national government, such as it was just coming into play. During the Stamp Act crisis, there had been correspondence between the various colonies, and as things became more critical, committees of correspondence were formed so that there could be a formal system of exchange of information and colonial solidarity. And then the First Continental Congress met. It was not really a national government. It was sort of an emergency meeting of beleaguered colonies. The colonies were very separate and self-reliant and jealous of their own prerogatives at this time. There was no national government. I mean, when Maryland thought of things, it looked to Great Britain, to London. When Virginia thought of its public affairs, it looked to the Crown or to London. These were bilateral relationships between Great Britain and Georgia and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and so on. Each one had a slightly different colonial charter. And so suddenly now with this crisis, we had to decide, first of all, is this Massachusetts or is this America? And we soon realized what happens in Massachusetts may be a flashpoint. In some sense, it may even be a Massachusetts rebellion, but it has implications for all of us. And so there was a movement towards a kind of colonial and even national unity, and that found its expression in the somewhat, I won't say half-hearted, but less intense First Continental Congress. But by the time the Second Continental Congress met, we realized there was going to have to be a provisional government of the nation of these united, beleaguered colonies to get us through this. We were going to have to give mutual aid. Horses were going to have to come from one colony to another. Guns would be manufactured in certain places, but not others. There were gunpowder plants and lead mines, and all of this was going to have some national distribution and coordination if we were going to survive. And so the national government of the United States was forced upon us. It was born in crisis. I doubt that there would have been a national government of the United States, at least for decades, and maybe forever, if the British had treated each of its colonies with proper respect and dignity.
Do you recall, sir, when the news arrived in Virginia, what the reaction was?
The reaction was horror. It's not that we weren't able to anticipate that something like this was coming, but we hoped that it would never happen. And I think the thing that people of your time need to understand more than anything else is that we regarded ourselves as British citizens. We weren't hankering after independence. We didn't see ourselves as separate from Britain. We didn't wish to be our own sovereign. I was born a British citizen. John Adams was born a British citizen. George Washington, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams. We regarded ourselves as no different from someone in Birmingham or Manchester or Oxford or Cambridge or London or Southampton or Plymouth. We were just farther away. And when we discovered that that's not how the British saw us, at least the British ministry and the Parliament saw us as some sort of colonial yahoos, some sort of faraway barbarians that were barely worthy of minimal respect, that hurt our feelings. I actually wrote some things about that in the Declaration of Independence, and the Congress removed them because they thought they were too personal and too filled with emotion. But the fact is that it hurt our feelings when we realized that they did not regard us as their equals. They regarded us as savages who were at some sort of faraway outpost on the edge of the great woods of North America, living in huts and having daily commerce with beasts of the field, wolves and coyotes and badgers and bears. This was a blow to our pride, and it had the secondary effect of forcing us together. So how did the news come? There were post riders. There were people moving up and down the eastern colonies. There were ships that would be going from Boston to the Chesapeake and so on. Newspapers didn't have a coordinating system of exchange at the time, but they did travel in the post, and so a newspaper might be picked up in Boston, and someone might drop it at a tavern in Philadelphia, where it would be reprinted there, and that newspaper might find its way to say Mount Vernon, and these things traveled in this somewhat informal way. But itinerant preachers were wandering about the country, and they would carry the news, sometimes imperfectly embodied, but they would carry the news from one location to the next. And so there was what in your time would be regarded as an exceedingly inefficient and informal system of exchange, but it worked. And it didn't take more than a few days for the news of Lexington and Concord to sweep through the 13 original colonies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. That question comes again from Stephen Shepard, who listens on KRCC 91.5 FM in Colorado Springs, sir. Our next question comes from Rick Flint. It's about the founders and that they apparently did not anticipate the rise of political parties. And our current system of government cannot be adequately analyzed in terms of what was intended. Do you agree?
Yes. I was not one of the founders in that I was not at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, but I'm among the founding generation, and I understand what our political vision was. I wrote that now famous letter in which I said, if I could only go to heaven at the head of a party, I would rather not go at all, that I had never submitted the whole body of my opinions in philosophy, religion, politics, or anything else to any faction of men. We believed that parties were a sign of decadence and that they eroded individual conscience, that if I believe certain things about life, I'm entitled to that intellectual and political sovereignty. But if I join a party or a faction, now I'm being encouraged to hold the line. There are party whips. That term is used deliberately to hold members of that party in line on questions of public policy, so that the early Federalist Party would all respond in a certain way to circumstance, and then the emerging Anti-Federalist Party would respond as a phalanx, as a monolith, rather than a collection of people with individual consciences. That really offends me, because I believe that as a mature and well-educated human being, I might differ from Mr. Madison on some questions, but agree with Monroe, and I might agree with Monroe on some questions, but not with John Taylor of Caroline. And
it wasn't simply a case of I'm a Federalist, I must support this.
That was coming, and that's what I worried about. I didn't want that sort of party discipline where everybody is whipped into a certain response to every single public question. That erodes the sovereignty of the individual and the individual human consciousness. We can't all agree on all of these questions. We don't form a phalanx unless we submit or surrender ourselves to it, which I think is a fundamental degradation of the human spirit. So we all felt this. The Constitution was written in Philadelphia by men who did not think that a party system would emerge. And if they had known that a party system would emerge, and by the way, very quickly too, they would have written a different constitution. For example, the most famous example is the way the president is elected. Under the original system of the Electoral College, the president would be the person who got the highest number of electoral votes, and the vice president would be the runner-up. And the idea was the most respected person in the country would be president, and the second most respected person would be vice president. They would not have party affiliations. They would just be extraordinary human beings. Well, that lasted for one and only one administration. The only nonpartisan administration in American history was that of George Washington. And even then, in his second term, the beginnings of the party system had already begun to gel, and he was bedeviled by party faction in the second term. And I will say, just for the point of historical candor, that I inadvertently was one of the people who helped to create the party of opposition, which was then known as the Republican Party, the small r Republican Party.
I can't imagine you had any idea what you were creating.
No.
Mr. Flint started his question actually by saying, I suggest that the more power within a government is dispersed, the less likely it is the government will be able to accomplish anything meaningful.
I disagree with that. In my vision, take the United States Senate. In your time, it has 100 members. My vision of it would be that these would be 100 remarkable human beings, each of whom was unique, not all of whom ever agreed, that there were no parties, there were no factions, that this was a group of extraordinary and thoughtful human beings who worked from evidence, who consulted their conscience. And I would hope that the leader of the party, the Speaker of the House, or the Senate Majority Leader, or whatever else you wish to call that person, whoever was chosen to lead on critical questions, would turn to the other 99 and say, gather evidence, talk it through, vote your conscience. Vote your conscience.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. I have another question here. This one comes from Jim Gober. He writes, I'm interested to hear the president's opinion on the importance of obtaining congressional approval or providing notification prior to using military force.
I feel very strongly about this question. The Constitution makers in Philadelphia reserved two functions of government exclusively to the House of Representatives. One of them is taxation, and the other is making war or declarations of war. And here's the logic of it. These are extraordinarily serious things. This is not about what kind of a school you create or what its curriculum might look like or whether you tax whiskey and not shipping. This is about the basic stuff of a civilization, and nothing is graver than going to war, and almost nothing is graver than taxing the people. And so the Founding Fathers wisely decided that revenue measures must begin not in the Senate, not in the executive, not in the judiciary, but in the House of Representatives, because the House is that body of our national government that is closest to the people and most responsive to the will of the people. And so if the House votes excessive taxes, then the people can retire the House of Representatives within 2 years. But if the Senate did it, it might take 6 years for the people to retire those people who weren't representing their interests carefully. And so the House is meant to be almost a barometric reading of the mood of the people and the will of the people. And if you're going to tax them, then you must do it through that body where the people have more control than they do in any other part of their national government. And war, of course, is dramatically more important than that, because war is sending your children, your sons and your nephews and your cousins into harm's way where they may not return, or if they do, they may return maimed. So it's absolutely essential that these measures begin in the House of Representatives, and the president is the commander-in-chief, but he must submit his plans in advance to the House of Representatives.
Mr. Gober also asks, of course, I'm suspecting you knew this was coming, he wants to hear about your actions against the Barbary pirates.
Congress was in recess at the time. We had my first cabinet meeting about this crisis in the spring of 1801. I sent a small expeditionary force to protect American shipping in the Mediterranean, but I immediately consulted Congress and made sure that it was Congress and the House of Representatives that took the lead in this thing. I am very deeply uncomfortable with any unilateral military action by the government of the United States, and particularly by the administration. You must, of course, in times of emergency act, but the minute Congress reassembles, or you reassemble it in emergency business, then it's the House that must take this up.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Jefferson.
You are welcome, sir.
We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now successfully out of tights and wig.
It was so good to hear from the president
this
week.
And here I am with the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You have an actual
plaque, and I bring it out every show just to remind myself of who I really am.
What fun to be in character this week and to try to answer listener questions.
Yeah, and there were some good questions, some tough ones. One you might want to come back to. But before we go there, if we might.
Yes, sir.
I have a very interesting question mailed to us by Kim Wheeler. I'm going to hand it to you and let you read it. I don't know if you've read that one or not.
This question is not for President Jefferson, says Kim Wheeler, but for David and Clay. I re-listened to an episode in 2018 about James Madison. You spoke about Jefferson's last letter to Madison, asking him to look after him in death. My first reaction upon hearing this request was to feel sorry for Madison that he had to carry that heavy burden of defending his dear friend. Do you, David and Clay, feel that you are continuing the work of Madison to look after Jefferson? What a great letter. Yes and no. I mean, obviously.
It would be a no for me.
I feel yes, but I mean, I also want to say in great modest sincerity, we're a tiny little part of the Jefferson world. He doesn't need us, doesn't need me. But I do think that Jefferson needs his advocates. And, I have this book coming out called Repairing Jefferson's America. And that's its whole point, David, is that Jefferson himself is now kind of a slightly toxified figure because of slavery and Sally Hemings and so on and so forth. And I take that very seriously, as you know. But the Jeffersonian, his outlook on what a republic does, what a great society looks like, how we protect ourselves from descending into monarchy and oligarchy and militarism and so on. We need those Jeffersonian precepts and his enormous persuasive power more than we've ever needed it before. What's missing in our system of Democrats and Republicans and a handful of socialists and so on is the Jeffersonian. We need that idea of civility, science, integrity, small r Republican virtue, a belief in the human project, a belief that education is the most important thing that a nation does. We need that now more than ever. We're circling the drain here.
But the point of...
And Jefferson is the answer, I think.
It is sort of a tough thing to ask. So, look after me when dead. Well, what are you going to say? No?
He says it in that last letter to Madison. He says, take care of me when dead. And Madison did it. And it was a burden because Jefferson was not easy to defend. And today, Jefferson is not easy to defend because of race and slavery, mostly.
Right, which is why the short answer for me is no. And I would say, looking at the way you deal with these questions about Jefferson, you're not out to protect him. You're out to give historical perspective, explain him.
But I do think that for Madison, let's just keep it in the historical frame for a moment. For him, it wasn't race and slavery or Native Americans. It was that Jefferson was capable of these wild rhetorical statements about liberty and revolution and so on. And the Kentucky resolutions and this kind of the wild radical streak in Jefferson. And Madison was always able to kind of tamp that down a little. But once Jefferson was dead, these statements about, that somebody else's religion neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, and all this kind of wild talk that Jefferson was capable of, like no other founding father, by the way, Madison had to try to defend that.
And he did.
And did a great job of it. But it was a burden. And I'll bet there were conversations with Dolly Madison, and when she said, this guy's dead.
Well, one thing I'm certain we can agree on. Great letter, great question.
Wonderful from Kim Wheeler. Thank you.
If we could, can we sneak another one in? I'm going to hand to you here.
I was introduced to the Jefferson Hour by accident, says Dan Wagman. Several years ago, I was heading home on a desolated county road after exploring the backcountry of Colorado.
Good for him.
And happened upon your show. I was fascinated by your talking as the third president. That was what hooked me. As the years have passed, I thought that Jefferson visited with us less and less, but wasn't sure.
Listen to what he's got statistics for you.
So I listened to the podcast. Now I decided to take a Jeffersonian approach. I downloaded all podcasts with a date of 2019 to see how many times the old boy, Jefferson, was visiting. Out of 52 shows, Jefferson spoke in only 22. That's only 42% of the time. Since each show states that your weekly conversation is with Thomas Jefferson, kindly consider having him appear more frequently.
Oh, my. Well, first off, Jefferson appears in every show.
In one way or another.
Not in the podcast, but in the broadcast versions. We start with what would Jefferson do. It's the
Plus,
first
we
thing.
never do any out-of-character program without quoting Jefferson and bringing him in. But he's
got
right.
a point.
But let me answer it. I agree. I sometimes feel that here in the barn, and I feel like we need to suit up more. But we're living through one of the most critical moments of my lifetime, certainly. I think one of the most critical moments in American history. It's forced us out of our comfort zone. I take no joy in talking about the current crisis, and it's not just the impeachment crisis.
But there are those listeners who write us and say, enough with the current politics. We tune in because we want to hear Jefferson.
Right, and I think it has to be balanced. But what I'm saying, David, is that circumstance has forced our hand. It's happened a couple of previous times, including in 2003 and the run-up to the Iraq War. Some things are so important from a Jeffersonian Republican point of view that I feel we would be making a terrible mistake in not addressing them. And I do believe that the current situation is one of the most fundamental, pivotal moments in American history. And if we didn't address it, we would be failing really in an extraordinary and dramatic sense to do our job.
It's almost time for this week's essay, but Clay, there was one question that I presented to President Jefferson from Rick Flint that I saw you kind of react to about the two-party system, the founders not anticipating it.
No, they couldn't have anticipated this, and because of that, that puts us partly in the current crisis, because they expected a nonpartisan America, so the Senate would be people with no political party affiliation. They would just be X number of senators, in our case 100. And when an impeachment came, either of a cabinet official or a justice of the courts or whatever, they would sit like a jury and listen to the evidence and then react with their conscience, with their best sense of what the evidence showed or didn't show, and also a significant reading of the impeachment provisions of the Constitution of the United States. Not one of the founding fathers could have anticipated that this would just simply come down essentially along party lines, that there would be a kind of a serious, even vicious partisanship, Party A versus Party B. Party A says throw the bum out. Party B says nothing here happened. Not any of the founding fathers could have anticipated that we would wind up in this situation. And had they known it, had they known that the party system was going to happen that soon and become that baked in, to use the term of our time, they would have devised an entirely different system for handling questions of abuse of power.
I would like to explore that with Mr. Jefferson. I did think it was quite notable that towards the end of his answer, he acknowledged that he was one of the creators of this problem in a roundabout way.
He and Madison essentially birthed the party system, even though Jefferson was the lesser player in it. But Madison and Jefferson both felt the Federalists are out of control. The party who created the government doesn't believe in the democratic project. We're going to have to take this country back. And the way they did it was to assemble a group of friends. Friends is bigger than friendship. And those friends formed the early Republican Party. And so Jefferson bears a lot of responsibility here, even though his political value system and his theory said no parties.
I must thank you, sir, for an enlightening conversation, and Mr. Jefferson. I always enjoy hearing from the both of you. But right now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thomas Jefferson has somehow gotten under my skin. As I've grown older in my tights and wig, in some respects I've become a radical and even at times a paper revolutionary. When I began investigating Mr. Jefferson 30 years ago, tentatively beginning to portray him, I was mostly interested in his agrarian vision for this country. The sentence that then engaged my soul most was, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." Among other things, that could be the mission statement of my native North Dakota. I knew Jefferson was a revolutionary then, but he always seemed to me to be a mild-mannered and extremely civil revolutionary. A revolutionary out of a Jane Austen novel, perhaps. A revolutionary who served Chateau Yquem in perfect cut-glass decanters. In my experience, most people grow more conservative as they get older. You know the old cliches. A conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. Or if you aren't a liberal when you're young, you have no heart, but if you aren't a conservative in middle age, you have no head. To my considerable chagrin, I have felt some hardening of my spiritual and political arteries as I have advanced in age. But in the last few years, I have found myself becoming more disenchanted with the existing order of things, more certain that the world is rigged on behalf of a tiny handful of individuals who don't really deserve all they have grabbed, partly because they are talented, partly because they are lucky, and in many cases simply because they are corrupt. Jefferson called these folks pseudo-aristocrats. He wanted to replace them with men and women of actual merit. These he called natural aristocrats, individuals who excel in virtue, learning, artistic expression, philosophy, and enlightenment. Conservatives like Newt Gingrich like to argue that the current distribution of wealth is the natural order of things. But we all know that's baloney. God could not have intended millions, even billions of human beings to live close to the bone of mere survival, while a handful of self-selected winners live like gods on earth and tell the rest of us we are not working hard enough. When Jefferson saw the way the class system in France had ground 95% or more of the French people into powder, he wrote to his friend Charles Bellini, "It is a true picture of that country to which they say we shall pass hereafter, and where we are to see God and his angels in splendor, and crowds of the damned trampled under their feet." In other words, Thomas Jefferson was not a natural radical. He was radicalized by what he saw in pre-revolutionary France, and therefore determined that what happened there must never be allowed to happen in the United States. But guess what? It has happened, and it has poisoned American life. The only difference is that we are a country so profoundly rich that even the table scraps are enough to buy off revolution. Here, widescreen televisions and the Kardashians are the opiate of the masses, and that reality show that propelled Donald Trump into the presidency. Jefferson was so disturbed by what he saw in France that he decided that the bloody and disruptive revolution was justified, including its excesses. He rebuked his hand-wringing, privileged friend Lafayette by declaring, "We are not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty on a featherbed." And that is why Jefferson wrote the most radical letter of his entire life to his protege William Short when the French Revolution had descended into the Reign of Terror. I'm quoting, "The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest, and was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood? Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country, and left free, it would be better than as it now is." Strong words from a naturally civil and gentle man who saw what happens when we let self-appointed, self-perpetuating cadres appropriate the wealth of nations and then hire lackeys to pass laws protecting their unearned gains. I believe that the gap between the haves and the have-nots of the world, particularly in the United States, is obscene, illegitimate, and unsustainable. A few hundred families now essentially control the wealth of the United States. Many of them do each other favors when they meet on private islands, in Aspen and Jackson Hole's gated communities, at the hyper-exclusive Yellowstone Club in the mountains of Montana. They have bought senators and congressmen, governors and state legislators who protect their private interests while lying to the rest of us with such terms as tax reform and national energy policy. I do not believe the CEO of a large corporation, no matter how talented, should earn $30 million per year while a worker in his factory is paid $17 per hour. I do not believe that the super-rich should have concierge health care while millions of Americans are unable to afford any health care whatsoever and are forced to crawl into emergency rooms when they need basic medical attention. I do not believe that the super-rich should have 4 houses or 10 or even 3 while millions of Americans live in poverty and even in squalor. Of course, I believe in meritocracy, and that the people who have invested in their training and professional mastery should be paid somewhat more than those who are unskilled workers. But I even have some late-night doubts about that. I certainly don't think that the rich are entitled to all that they have. I'm with Mr. Jefferson in believing that an enlightened society needs to find ways to redistribute wealth and opportunity from time to time so that everyone has something like an equal chance of living in very modest prosperity. I'm with Mr. Jefferson that the best use of public funds is to invest in creative, emphatic, inexpensive, or free public education, including high-quality vocational education, because I believe with Jefferson that the best way to solve most social problems is education. Why is a daycare provider paid $32,000 per year and the manager of a hedge fund $32 million? Why does a teacher buy colored pencils and poster board from her own salary because the local school system is starved for funds, while the rich bribe Stanford and USC with cash payments of up to $500,000 to admit their marginally talented children? Why is a veteran of our wars homeless and unable to take care of the basic needs of his life, while the people who manufactured those planes and those cruise missiles is living in absolute luxury? Why is a family farmer edging up to Chapter 11, while the USDA pays Monsanto, ConAgra, and DuPont hundreds of millions of dollars of tax money per year to perpetuate chemically adulterated monoculture in California's Central Valley? The conservatives blather on about welfare, food stamps, subsidized school lunches, and permanent dependencies. But if you eliminated all government welfare programs overnight, including corporate welfare, middle-class welfare, and tax shelters for the very rich, it wouldn't be the poor who howled in the streets, but the most comfortable and privileged Americans. How the American people have been drugged into thinking all of this is natural and okay is perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of population management. Thomas Jefferson was on to all of this. He sought desperately to prevent from happening what has now happened to America. He was an imperfect embodiment of the egalitarian and revolutionary spirit, I know. But the fact is, we need his moral clarity and his gifts of persuasion now more than ever. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.